Long day. I'll be home soon. Angela had always been his rock, the one person who truly understood him. She knew how hard he had worked to get to this point, how much he sacrificed to climb the culinary ladder. When he felt like giving up, she was the one who reminded him of his talent, his worth. But tonight, he didn't want to burden her with his disappointment. Not yet. A few minutes later, he returned to the kitchen to finish up the cleanup. The other chefs were already winding down, but there was a strange tension in the air. It was Sophie who finally broke the silence. "Chef, what do you think about the new guy?" she asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus shrugged, though inside he was still reeling. "I don't know yet. We'll see how it goes." Sophie exchanged a glance with one of the other line cooks, her expression betraying her concern. I hope things don't change too much. We all know how much you've put into this place." Her words, though well-meaning, only deepened the pit of unease in Marcus's stomach. "Thanks, Sophie," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But don't worry about me. Just keep doing what you do best." The truth was, Marcus didn't know how things would change. All he knew was that the future he had envisioned for himself suddenly felt a lot less certain. The next morning, Marcus arrived at La Reverie earlier than usual. The restaurant was quiet, the air still carrying the faint aroma of last night's service. As he walked through the kitchen, he thought about all the late nights he had spent perfecting his craft here, the sacrifices he had made to prove himself. His culinary journey had not been easy, especially as a black chef in a predominantly white industry, but he had fought tooth and nail to get where he was. As he stood in front of the stove, the weight of his journey settled on his shoulders. Memories of his early days flashed through his mind. His first job as a line cook in a small bistro, the grueling hours, the sweat, the burns, the constant need to prove himself over and over again. He had thought he was past all that, but now, with Chef Devereux's arrival, those old insecurities began to creep back in. Around noon, Chef Devereux arrived, sweeping into the kitchen with an air of entitlement. He barely acknowledged Marcus as he strode toward the counter where the day's fresh ingredients were laid out. Without a word, he began rearranging the setup, moving Marcus's carefully prepared mise-en-place aside, as if it were inconsequential. Marcus watched in silence, his jaw clenched. He had worked for years to establish a rhythm in this kitchen, to earn the respect of his colleagues and create a collaborative environment. But within minutes, it was clear that Chef Devereux had no interest in collaboration. "Chef Hayes," Devereux finally said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you'll be assisting with the sauces today." Marcus blinked, taken aback by the sudden demotion. He had always overseen the entire kitchen, managing everything from appetizers to entrees, but now he was being relegated to a secondary role. His pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. "I usually oversee the whole service. Is there a reason you're changing things up?" Devereux smirked, not even bothering to look up from the cutting board. La Reverie is a fine dining establishment with a reputation for tradition. We're not here to experiment with. He waved his hand dismissively. Creative twists. Focus on the sauces today, Chef Hayes. Let me handle the rest. It was more than a slight. It was a direct attack on everything Marcus had worked for. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt the sting of discrimination that had followed him throughout his career, simmering just below the surface. A recipe for resilience. The months that followed felt like a slow, suffocating descent. Marcus had thought that his years of dedication to La Reverie had earned him not just respect but security, a place where his talent was recognized and valued. But Chef Lucien Devereux's arrival shattered that illusion. In the beginning, Marcus tried to adapt. Every day, he arrived at the kitchen with the same determination he had always carried. Despite the growing tension, he focused on his work, ensuring that every sauce he prepared, every dish he touched, was a reflection of his skill. But the kitchen that had once been his sanctuary was now a hostile environment. Devereux made it clear, subtly, at first, then more overtly, that Marcus's creativity and vision were not welcome. A taste of ambition. Marcus Hayes stood in the kitchen of La Reverie, one of the most prestigious French restaurants in the city. The familiar sounds of clattering pots, the sizzle of meats, and the sharp clinks of knives against cutting boards filled the air. It was his domain, the place where he felt most alive. The restaurant's polished stainless steel counters gleamed under the bright overhead lights, reflecting the intense focus etched on Marcus's face. His dark hands moved with practiced precision, dicing fresh herbs with the kind of finesse only a seasoned chef could muster. Tonight, like many others, Marcus found himself at the helm of the restaurant's bustling kitchen, overseeing the preparation of their most prized dishes. As the head sous chef, his responsibilities were immense, but the passion that burned inside him made it all worth it. For years, he had honed his craft in kitchens across the city, climbing the ranks with dedication, talent, and a fierce love for cooking. And now, at La Reverie, he was one step away from his dream of becoming a head chef. The smell of rosemary, thyme, and simmering butter wafted through the air, making Marcus's mouth water even though he had prepared the dishes countless times. Tonight's special was his own creation, a fusion of traditional French cuisine with a Caribbean twist. A seared duck breast glazed with a spiced tamarind reduction, served over a delicate truffle-infused polenta. It was bold, unique, and exactly the kind of food Marcus wanted to be known for. Chef Hayes, Sophie, one of the younger line cooks, called out, pulling him from his thoughts. "Table 5 loved your duck. They're asking to meet the chef." A warm smile spread across Marcus's face. Compliments like these reminded him why he put in the long hours and endured the grueling demands of the culinary world. It wasn't just about feeding people, it was about creating an experience, evoking emotions with flavors that told a story. He wiped his hands on his apron, nodding toward Sophie. "Thanks, Sophie. I'll head out in a minute." As he turned to plate the next dish, the kitchen door swung open, and the sound of footsteps echoed on the tiled floor. Marcus looked up to see Anthony Delacroix, the restaurant's owner and current head chef, standing in the doorway with a tall, thin man in a crisp white chef's coat at his side. The newcomer's presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. His cold blue eyes swept across the bustling kitchen with an air of superiority, and his mouth curved into a tight, humorless smile. "Marcus," Delacroix said, his voice as smooth as the expensive wines he served to his guests. "I'd like you to meet Chef Lucien Devereaux. He'll be joining us as the new head chef." Marcus froze, the smile on his face fading as quickly as it had appeared. New head chef. His heart sank. He had been under the impression that he was being groomed for the position, that his years of loyalty and hard work would finally pay off. The moment felt like a punch to the gut. Chef Devereaux extended a hand, though the gesture seemed more obligatory than genuine. "Pleasure," he said, his French accent thick. Marcus forced a smile and shook the man's hand, but his mind raced with questions. Why hadn't Delacroix mentioned this before? They had spoken just last week about Marcus's future at the restaurant, about his vision for La Reverie. There had been no hint of an outsider coming in to take the role Marcus had been working toward for years. "Marcus here is the soul of our kitchen," Delacroix continued, clapping a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "He's been with us for a long time and knows our menu inside and out. I expect you two will work closely together." Chef Devereaux's eyes narrowed slightly as they flicked toward Marcus, the smile never reaching his eyes. "I look forward to it." For the rest of the evening, Marcus struggled to focus. His mind kept drifting back to that brief exchange. He was well aware of how competitive the culinary world could be, but this felt like a betrayal. As the night wore on, Marcus continued plating his dishes with precision, but the passion that usually fueled him had dimmed, replaced by a gnawing sense of uncertainty. Later, as the final plates left the kitchen and the restaurant began to wind down, Marcus slipped into the back alley behind the restaurant to catch his breath. The cool night air hit his face, offering a brief reprieve from the heat and chaos of the kitchen. He leaned against the brick wall, his hands still slightly trembling from the adrenaline of the evening service. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick message to his wife, Angela. Marcus had always been known for his flair, for the way he could take a classic dish and elevate it with bold, unexpected flavors. He had earned his place at La Reverie by doing just that, but Devereux saw this innovation as an affront. Traditional French cuisine was sacred in his eyes, and any deviation from the established methods was a form of culinary blasphemy. "Stick to the recipe, Chef Hayes," Devereux would say with a smirk, barely glancing at Marcus's work. "We don't need any exotic modifications." Those words stung, not just because they dismissed Marcus's talent, but because they hinted at something deeper, something uglier. Marcus had faced prejudice before, but it had been a long time since he felt it so blatantly, so venomously. It wasn't just Devereux's dismissal of his food. It was the subtle jabs, the barely veiled condescension, the way he would question Marcus's decisions in front of the entire staff, undermining his authority. The other chefs, some of whom had worked alongside Marcus for years, were caught in an uncomfortable middle ground. They respected Marcus, but Devereux was their new boss. The more Devereux asserted his dominance, the quieter the kitchen became, the camaraderie that once filled the air dissolving into a thick, uneasy silence. One evening, after yet another grueling service where Marcus had been relegated to menial tasks, he found himself alone in the kitchen, long after the other chefs had left. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall were the only sounds as he stood at the counter, staring down at a blank page in his recipe notebook. His hands, which once moved with such confidence, now hovered over the page, hesitant. For the first time in years, he felt like an imposter in his own kitchen. The vibrant ideas that used to flow from his mind now felt trapped, suffocated by the constant pressure to conform to Devereux's rigid standards. Marcus closed the notebook and sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He had never felt so defeated. Angela's voice echoed in his mind. "You're more than this restaurant, Marcus. You've always been more." He thought about her, waiting for him at home, always ready with a smile, always there to lift him up. She had been his anchor through everything, supporting him when he doubted himself, cheering him on when he reached new heights. But lately, even she had noticed the change in him. The Marcus that came home after his shifts was no longer the passionate chef she had fallen in love with. He was quieter, more withdrawn, his frustration leaking into their once happy home. As Marcus cleaned up the kitchen, preparing to head home, Devereux appeared in the doorway, his arms crossed. "Still here, Hayes?" he asked, his voice as cold as ever. "Just finishing up," Marcus replied, keeping his tone neutral. Devereux stepped into the kitchen, his eyes scanning the countertops with a critical gaze. "You've been here a long time, haven't you?" Marcus tensed, unsure where the conversation was headed. "Yeah, about 5 years." Devereux nodded, though his expression didn't soften. "Impressive. But I've been thinking, maybe it's time for some changes. The restaurant needs to evolve, and I'm not sure everyone here fits into that vision." There it was, plain as day. Marcus could feel the weight of those words, the unspoken meaning behind them. He wasn't part of Devereux's future for La Reverie. Before Marcus could respond, Devereux continued, "I'll be speaking with Delacroix soon about some staff adjustments. Just a heads up." Marcus clenched his fists at his sides, fighting to keep his composure. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to tell Devereux exactly what he thought of his so-called vision. But deep down, Marcus knew that no matter what he said, Devereux had already made up his mind. 2 weeks later, Marcus was called into Delacroix's office. The conversation was brief and painfully predictable. Delacroix, who had once praised Marcus for his innovation and leadership, now spoke in corporate platitudes. "We appreciate everything you've done for La Reverie, Marcus, but Chef Devereux believes it's time for a change in the kitchen. We're going in a new direction, and, well, we think it's best if we part ways." Marcus sat in stunned silence, the words barely registering at first. Part ways. After everything he had given to this restaurant. After years of pouring his heart and soul into the food, the team, the very reputation of La Reverie. But as Delacroix droned on about severance packages and references, Marcus's shock turned to a cold, quiet anger. He had seen this coming. He had felt it in the way Devereaux treated him, the way Delacroix had distanced himself in recent weeks. And yet, knowing it was inevitable didn't make it any easier to swallow. The following day, Marcus cleaned out his locker, gathering his knives and personal belongings. The kitchen staff, unsure of how to react, offered awkward goodbyes. Some of the younger chefs, like Sophie, looked genuinely upset, but no one spoke out. Devereaux had made sure of that. As Marcus walked out of La Reverie for the last time, the weight of the door closing behind him felt symbolic, as if an entire chapter of his life had slammed shut. He had given everything to that restaurant, and now he was leaving with nothing but a box of his belongings and the bitter taste of injustice in his mouth. At home, Angela was waiting for him, just as she always had been. When Marcus walked through the door, she took one look at him and knew. "It's over," he said quietly, setting the box down on the kitchen table. The words felt heavy in his throat, as if saying them out loud made the loss more real. Angela wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I'm sorry, Marcus," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. "I know how much this meant to you." For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to just stand there, enveloped in her warmth, the weight of the last few months finally crashing down on him. But as he held her, something began to shift inside him. It wasn't just the pain of losing his job. It was the realization that this wasn't the end. Angela pulled back slightly, looking up at him with those eyes that had always seen him for who he truly was. "You're not done, Marcus. You know that, right? This isn't the end of your story." Her words ignited a small spark in his chest, one that had been buried beneath months of frustration and doubt. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure if he believed it yet. But Angela's unwavering belief in him was enough to keep that spark alive. As the days passed, Marcus began to pick himself up, piece by piece. It wasn't easy. There were days when the anger and disappointment threatened to pull him under. But Angela's faith in him, and his own deep-seated love for cooking, wouldn't let him stay down for long. Marcus knew that his time at La Reverie had come to an unfair end, but he also knew that he wasn't finished. He was more than that restaurant, more than the position that had been taken from him. He had a gift, a vision, and a dream that had been simmering inside him for years. And now, without the weight of someone else's expectations holding him back, Marcus was free to pursue it. Reinvention. For the first few weeks after leaving La Reverie, Marcus felt adrift. The routine he had known for years, early mornings in the kitchen, late nights refining recipes, the constant hum of service, was suddenly gone, leaving an unsettling void. His days stretched on, empty and unfamiliar. He spent hours in the kitchen at home, cooking dishes he had long neglected, but it wasn't the same. The fire that had once driven him felt dim, smothered by the bitter taste of his departure from La Reverie. Angela, ever patient, gave him the space he needed to process everything. She knew Marcus well enough to recognize that pushing him before he was ready wouldn't help, but every night, after the day's quiet frustrations, she reminded him of one simple truth. This isn't the end. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Angela broke the silence. "Marcus," she said softly, "what do you want to do next?" He didn't answer right away. It was a question that had haunted him since the day he walked out of La Reverie, but he had avoided facing it. For so long, his identity had been tied to that restaurant. Without it, who was he? "I don't know," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I spent years building something there, and now, it feels like it's all gone." Angela frowned, her eyes full of concern, but also determination. "It's not gone. You built your reputation, your skills, and your style. La Reverie didn't give that to you. You brought it to them. They're the ones who lost something, not you. Marcus looked at her, the weight of her words slowly sinking in. Maybe she was right. Maybe everything he had done wasn't erased just because Devereaux had pushed him out, but knowing that and believing it were two different things. Have you ever thought about doing something of your own? Angela asked, her tone light but deliberate. Marcus blinked. Like what? Angela smiled. I don't know. Starting your own place. A restaurant where you can create what you want, without anyone looking over your shoulder or telling you to stick to the recipe. The idea hit Marcus like a jolt of electricity. His own place. He had entertained the thought before, in those fleeting moments between shifts at La Reverie, but it had always seemed like a distant dream. Something for the future, when he had more time, more experience, more confidence. But now, what was stopping him? The next morning, Marcus woke up with a sense of purpose that had been missing for weeks. He grabbed his notebook, the same one that had lain abandoned on the counter since his departure from La Reverie, and began scribbling ideas. Menus, concepts, names. It felt exhilarating, a kind of creative rush he hadn't felt in years. His first idea was simple but powerful, a restaurant that celebrated fusion cuisine, blending the bold flavors he loved with the French techniques he had mastered. He envisioned a space that was warm and inviting, the kind of place where people came not just for the food, but for the experience. A restaurant that was a reflection of him, his heritage, his creativity, and his love for pushing boundaries. The more he wrote, the clearer his vision became. This would be a place where no one told him what he could or couldn't do, where he could experiment with flavors and ingredients, blending the rich, soulful dishes of his Creole roots with the refined precision of French gastronomy. It would be a culinary journey, one that embraced innovation without abandoning tradition. Marcus spent hours each day fleshing out the concept, mapping out potential dishes, thinking about the kind of atmosphere he wanted to create. The more he planned, the more excited he became, but there was one lingering obstacle: the reality of starting a restaurant from scratch. Opening a restaurant was no small feat. The financial risks were immense, the workload even more so. He would need investors, a location, staff, suppliers, and most daunting of all, he would need to rebuild his reputation, which had been tarnished by his unceremonious exit from La Reverie. The restaurant world was small, and word traveled fast. He knew there were whispers about him, rumors fueled by Devereaux's influence. If he wanted to succeed, he would have to overcome that. But Angela's voice was in his ear, her unwavering faith in him pushing him forward. You can do this, Marcus. You've always been able to do this. Marcus spent the next several weeks doing his research. He reached out to old contacts, some of whom were still loyal to him despite the fallout at La Reverie. He started looking at potential spaces for his restaurant, scouring the city for a location that felt right. He spent hours running numbers, calculating costs, figuring out what kind of investors he would need to approach. It was during one of these long research sessions that Marcus received an unexpected call. It was Sophie, one of the junior chefs who had worked under him at La Reverie. She had been quiet during his final weeks at the restaurant, one of the few who had seemed genuinely upset by his departure. Part 3. Reinvention. For the first few weeks after leaving La Reverie, Marcus felt adrift. The routine he had known for years, early mornings in the kitchen, late nights refining recipes, the constant hum of service, was suddenly gone, leaving an unsettling void. His days stretched on, empty and unfamiliar. He spent hours in the kitchen at home, cooking dishes he had long neglected, but it wasn't the same. The fire that had once driven him felt dim, smothered by the bitter taste of his departure from La Reverie. Angela, ever patient, gave him the space he needed to process everything. She knew Marcus well enough to recognize that pushing him before he was ready wouldn't help, but every night, after the day's quiet frustrations, she reminded him of one simple truth: this isn't the end. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Angela broke the silence. "Marcus," she said softly, "what do you want to do next?" He didn't answer right away. It was a question that had haunted him since the day he walked out of La Reverie, but he had avoided facing it. For so long, his identity had been tied to that restaurant. Without it, who was he? "I don't know," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I spent years building something there, and now it feels like it's all gone." Angela frowned, her eyes full of concern, but also determination. "It's not gone. You built your reputation, your skills, and your style. La Reverie didn't give that to you. You brought it to them. They're the ones who lost something, not you." Marcus looked at her, the weight of her words slowly sinking in. Maybe she was right. Maybe everything he had done wasn't erased just because Devereaux had pushed him out, but knowing that and believing it were two different things. "Have you ever thought about doing something of your own?" Angela asked, her tone light but deliberate. Marcus blinked. "Like what?" Angela smiled. "I don't know. Starting your own place, a restaurant where you can create what you want, without anyone looking over your shoulder or telling you to stick to the recipe." The idea hit Marcus like a jolt of electricity. His own place. He had entertained the thought before, in those fleeting moments between shifts at La Reverie, but it had always seemed like a distant dream. Something for the future, when he had more time, more experience, more confidence. But now, what was stopping him? The next morning, Marcus woke up with a sense of purpose that had been missing for weeks. He grabbed his notebook, the same one that had lain abandoned on the counter since his departure from La Reverie, and began scribbling ideas. Menus, concepts, names. It felt exhilarating, the kind of creative rush he hadn't felt in years. His first idea was simple but powerful, a restaurant that celebrated fusion cuisine, blending the bold flavors he loved with the French techniques he had mastered. He envisioned a space that was warm and inviting, the kind of place where people came not just for the food, but for the experience. A restaurant that was a reflection of him, his heritage, his creativity, and his love for pushing boundaries. The more he wrote, the clearer his vision became. This would be a place where no one told him what he could or couldn't do, where he could experiment with flavors and ingredients, blending the rich, soulful dishes of his Creole roots with the refined precision of French gastronomy. It would be a culinary journey, one that embraced innovation without abandoning tradition. Marcus spent hours each day fleshing out the concept, mapping out potential dishes, thinking about the kind of atmosphere he wanted to create. The more he planned, the more excited he became, but there was one lingering obstacle: the reality of starting a restaurant from scratch. Opening a restaurant was no small feat. The financial risks were immense, the workload even more so. He would need investors, a location, staff, suppliers, and most daunting of all, he would need to rebuild his reputation, which had been tarnished by his unceremonious exit from La Reverie. The restaurant world was small, and word traveled fast. He knew there were whispers about him, rumors fueled by Devereaux's influence. If he wanted to succeed, he would have to overcome that. But Angela's voice was in his ear, her unwavering faith in him pushing him forward. "You can do this, Marcus. You've always been able to do this." Marcus spent the next several weeks doing his research. He reached out to old contacts, some of whom were still loyal to him despite the fallout at La Reverie. He started looking at potential spaces for his restaurant, scouring the city for a location that felt right. He spent hours running numbers, calculating costs, figuring out what kind of investors he would need to approach. It was during one of these long research sessions that Marcus received an unexpected call. It was Sophie, one of the junior chefs who had worked under him at La Reverie. She had been quiet during his final weeks at the restaurant, one of the few who had seemed genuinely upset by his departure. "Chef Hayes," she began, her voice hesitant, "I hope I'm not bothering you." Marcus smiled at the sound of her voice. "You're not, Sophie. What's up?" There was a pause on the other end, and when she spoke again, her tone was more determined. "I heard about what happened. I'm sorry. It wasn't fair. Marcus appreciated the sentiment, though it didn't change much. Thanks. It is what it is. I know, she said, but I also heard you're thinking about starting something of your own. A restaurant. Marcus raised an eyebrow. He hadn't told many people about his plans yet, but he supposed word got around fast. Yeah, it's in the early stages. Another pause. I'd like to be part of it. If you'll have me. Marcus blinked in surprise. Sophie had always been a promising chef, eager to learn and passionate about the craft. But more than that, she had been one of the few people at La Reverie who hadn't just seen him as a colleague or superior. She had seen him as a mentor. The idea of having her on his team filled him with a sense of possibility. You're serious? He asked. Absolutely, she replied without hesitation. La Reverie isn't the same without you, and I don't think it's where I belong anymore. I want to work with someone who's passionate about food, who actually cares about the people in the kitchen. That's you, chef. Marcus felt a warmth spread through him, a reassurance that maybe he wasn't as alone as he had thought. I'd be lucky to have you, Sophie. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus's vision began to take shape. He found a location in a vibrant part of town, a small but charming space with high ceilings and a cozy atmosphere. It wasn't flashy or grand like La Reverie, but it had character, and most importantly, it felt right. With Sophie's help, Marcus began assembling a team. He reached out to former colleagues, promising young chefs, and seasoned veterans alike. Slowly but surely, his kitchen began to take form. It was a diverse group, a melting pot of cultures and experiences, much like the food Marcus wanted to create. They were united by a shared passion for cooking and a belief in Marcus's vision. Angela was there every step of the way, offering advice, encouragement, and the occasional reality check when Marcus's ideas got too ambitious. But most importantly, she was his rock, the one who had believed in him when no one else did. The name of the restaurant came to him one night, in the quiet after a long day of planning. Sublime. It was simple, elegant, and perfectly captured what Marcus wanted his guests to experience. Something beyond the ordinary, something that lingered long after the meal was over. An experience that was more than just food. It was art, memory, and passion, all rolled into one. Opening night was a whirlwind of nerves and excitement. Marcus stood in the kitchen, watching as the first guests filled the dining room. The soft murmur of conversation, the clink of glasses, the subtle aroma of his dishes wafting from the kitchen. It was everything he had dreamed of. As the first plates went out, Marcus felt a surge of pride. This was his restaurant, his team, his food. After months of doubt, struggle, and reinvention, he had created something new, something that was entirely his own. Sublime was more than just a restaurant. It was a testament to Marcus's resilience, his ability to rise above adversity and redefine himself. And as he watched his guests take their first bites, their faces lighting up with delight, Marcus knew this was just the beginning. Rising stakes. A year had passed since Sublime first opened its doors, and Marcus Hayes stood in the quiet of his kitchen, the hum of the city outside muffled by the restaurant's walls. He had done it. His restaurant, his vision, had become a reality. But in the silence of the early morning, as the city slowly came to life, Marcus knew something was shifting. Sublime was no longer a hidden gem. It was on the verge of something bigger, something that could either catapult them into greatness or crush them under the weight of expectations. The restaurant had grown steadily in popularity, first through word of mouth, then through glowing reviews in local food blogs. Soon, critics began to take notice, with a few well-placed features in national publications drawing food lovers from all over the country. Every night, the dining room was packed, and reservations had to be booked weeks in advance. The energy was intoxicating, but with success came pressure, the kind of pressure Marcus knew all too well. As much as Marcus relished the growth of Sublime, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was looming on the horizon. He remembered his time at La Reverie, how quickly things could shift from excitement to chaos. from recognition to criticism. He had seen what success could do to a restaurant, how it could stretch a team too thin, how it could turn creativity into stagnation, how it could make every meal feel like a test rather than an experience. But this time, Marcus was determined to handle it differently. He wouldn't let the pressure warp his vision or undermine the people who had helped him build this place. He had learned those lessons the hard way. Sublime had to remain more than a restaurant. It had to be a refuge for creativity, a place where food was still an art, where the experience was as essential as the dishes themselves. One afternoon, in the middle of prep, Sophie rushed into the kitchen, her face flushed with a mix of excitement and anxiety. "Marcus, you need to see this," she said, thrusting her phone at him. On the screen was an article from one of the most prestigious food magazines in the world, Gastronom. Marcus's heart skipped a beat as he read the headline. "Is Sublime the next culinary phenomenon?" The article was a glowing review of the restaurant, praising everything from the innovative fusion dishes to the warm, intimate atmosphere. But what caught Marcus's attention was the last paragraph. "Sublime is poised to make waves not just locally, but internationally. Could Chef Marcus Hayes be the next contender for a Michelin star?" A Michelin star. Marcus's pulse quickened. It was the holy grail of the culinary world, a recognition that could change the trajectory of his career forever. But with that mention came a new kind of scrutiny. He knew that if Sublime was on Michelin's radar, the expectations for every single dish, every service, would be astronomical. The kitchen buzzed around him, oblivious to the storm that had just been set in motion. Marcus handed the phone back to Sophie, his expression unreadable. "We're not there yet," he said, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. "But we need to be ready." As the news spread, the pressure mounted. Sublime's reservations, already booked out weeks in advance, now had a waiting list months long. Diners arrived from across the globe, many of them coming with sky-high expectations. Marcus could feel the shift in the air. The restaurant was no longer just a passion project. It was now under the microscope of the global culinary elite. Michelin inspectors were notoriously secretive, arriving anonymously and unannounced, dining like any other guest. The uncertainty was nerve-wracking. Each night, Marcus found himself scanning the dining room, wondering which guest could be the one who would determine Sublime's fate. Were they sitting at the corner table by the window, savoring his lamb dish with its intricate blend of Creole spices and French techniques? Or were they in the center, tasting the seafood stew that had been a hit since day one? For the first time since opening, Marcus felt the weight of doubt creeping in. It wasn't the cooking that worried him. He had faith in his food, his team, and his vision. But he knew how fickle the industry could be. One off night, one dish that didn't meet expectations, could sink everything they had worked so hard to build. He refused to let that happen. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus tightened the ship. Every detail, from the timing of courses to the garnish on each plate, was scrutinized. He held meetings with his team, emphasizing the importance of consistency and excellence. But he also knew that the relentless pursuit of perfection could burn out even the most passionate chefs, so he made a point to remind them why they were there. "We've gotten this far because we love what we do," Marcus said during one particularly tense pre-service meeting. "I don't want us to lose that. The moment we start cooking for the critics, we've already failed." Sophie, who had grown into a formidable sous chef under Marcus's mentorship, nodded in agreement. She had become his right hand, the one who could execute his vision with precision, but also with heart. Her loyalty to Marcus and to Sublime was unwavering, and in her eyes he saw a reflection of his younger self, hungry, determined, and unafraid to take risks. The team rallied around Marcus's message. They knew the stakes were high, but they also knew why they were there. Each dish was a representation of the journey they had taken together, a fusion of cultures, flavors, and techniques that told a story unique to Sublime. But despite the unity in the kitchen, the pressure outside continued to build. Media coverage intensified, and soon enough, Rumors began circulating that a Michelin inspector had dined at Sublime. Marcus didn't know if the rumors were true, but the very possibility lit a fire in him. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Saturday, one of the busiest nights of the week. The restaurant was packed, the dining room filled with a mix of regulars and first-time guests. The energy was electric, but Marcus could feel something different in the air. There was a guest at table 12, dining alone, who caught his eye. They were unassuming, quiet, and focused intently on their meal. They had ordered several courses, each one more intricate than the last. There was no phone on the table, no chatter with the staff, just pure, deliberate attention to the food. Marcus's instincts told him this was the moment they had been waiting for. He didn't say anything to the team, not wanting to create panic, but in the back of his mind, he knew this guest could be the inspector. Every dish that went out after that was sent with an extra dose of care, each plate a canvas of Marcus's dedication to his craft. The night went by in a blur, each course timed to perfection. As the last plates were cleared and the guest at table 12 quietly left, Marcus felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. They had done everything they could. Now, all they could do was wait. Days passed, then weeks, and still no word from Michelin. Marcus tried to push the thought out of his mind, focusing instead on keeping the restaurant running smoothly. But the uncertainty gnawed at him, a constant reminder of the stakes. Then, one morning, as Marcus stood in the kitchen preparing for the day ahead, Angela burst in, a letter in hand. Her eyes were wide, her face flushed with excitement. "It's here," she said, breathless. Marcus took the letter, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen this envelope before, back in his law reverie days, when Devereux had been the one to open it. With trembling hands, Marcus tore it open and read the words inside. "Congratulations, Chef Marcus Hayes. Your restaurant, Sublime, has been awarded 1 Michelin star." He stared at the letter, the weight of it settling over him like a tidal wave. A Michelin star. He had done it. Sublime had done it. For a moment, Marcus couldn't speak. He looked at Angela, then at Sophie, who had gathered around him with the rest of the team. Their faces were a mix of pride, disbelief, and joy. "We did it," Marcus finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "We really did it." The kitchen erupted in cheers, the culmination of months, no, years, of hard work, sacrifice, and passion. But even in that moment of triumph, Marcus knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The weight of a star. The announcement of Sublime's Michelin star had sent shockwaves through the culinary world. In a matter of days, the restaurant had gone from being a beloved local favorite to an international sensation. Food critics hailed Marcus Hayes as one of the most innovative chefs of his generation, and every major publication wanted a piece of the story. The Michelin star was a badge of honor, a dream that many chefs spent their entire careers chasing, and Marcus had achieved it with a restaurant he had built from the ground up. Yet as Marcus stood in the middle of the bustling kitchen, watching his team work with a newfound intensity, he couldn't shake the feeling that the star, which had once seemed like the pinnacle of success, had now become a double-edged sword. Sublime had earned its place in the culinary pantheon, but the expectations that came with the Michelin recognition were staggering. Marcus knew all too well that a Michelin star wasn't just a celebration. It was also a target. One slip, one off night, and everything they had worked for could be called into question. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. This was no longer just about maintaining the quality they had worked so hard to achieve. It was about surpassing it. Every night from now on, every meal that left the kitchen had to be perfect. The following weeks were a whirlwind. The phone never stopped ringing, and the reservation book filled up faster than they could manage. Celebrities, food critics, and international travelers flocked to Sublime as if it were some kind of culinary pilgrimage. The pressure in the kitchen grew with each passing day, the weight of the star pressing down on everyone. Marcus was meticulous. He scrutinized every detail of the menu, tweaking recipes, refining techniques, and pushing his team harder than ever before. His attention to detail bordered on obsession, and while the staff admired his drive, they also began to feel the strain. Sophie, his sous chef, who had been his rock throughout this entire journey, seemed especially tense. "You've got to give yourself a break, Marcus," she said one night after service. The team had gone home, and it was just the two of them in the quiet of the kitchen. "You're going to burn out at this pace." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing with thoughts of the next day's service. "We can't afford to slip, Sophie. Not now. Not ever." "I know, but this is different," she said gently. "The team is feeling it too. You can't keep pushing them like this." Marcus looked at her, realizing she was right. The joy that had once filled the kitchen, the sense of camaraderie and passion that had defined Sublime, was starting to erode under the weight of his relentless pursuit of perfection. He had spent years chasing this dream, and now that it was real, he feared losing it more than anything. But in the process, he was losing something else, his connection to the very people who had helped him get here. "I don't want to lose what makes this place special," Marcus said quietly, almost to himself. "Then let's not," Sophie replied, her eyes steady. "We've got this far by doing things our way. Don't let the star change that." The next night, Marcus gathered the team before service. They were exhausted, worn down by the intensity of the last few weeks, but their dedication was unshakable. Marcus looked around at the faces of his staff, the people who had stood by him through every high and low, through the chaos of opening and the uncertainty of whether they would succeed. He owed it to them to lead not just with ambition, but with heart. "I know it's been tough lately," Marcus began, his voice carrying the weight of sincerity. "And I know the pressure has been overwhelming. But we didn't get here by trying to be something we're not. We got here because we love what we do. I don't want us to lose sight of that. We're not cooking for stars, or for critics, or for anyone else. We're cooking for the people who walk through those doors and trust us to give them an experience. That's what matters." There was a moment of silence as his words sank in. Then, one by one, the team nodded. Marcus could see the shift in their eyes, the return of the fire that had driven them from the start. It was as if the weight of the star had lifted, if only slightly, replaced by the reminder of why they were all here. As the weeks went on, Marcus found a new rhythm. The expectations were still sky-high, but he had learned to manage them without sacrificing the soul of the restaurant. He stopped obsessing over every minor detail, trusting Sophie and the rest of the team to do what they did best. He started experimenting in the kitchen again, creating new dishes that pushed the boundaries of what Sublime was known for, blending his classical French training with bold, unconventional flavors from his Creole roots. The food critics still came, the reservation book was still full, but the atmosphere in the kitchen had shifted. It was no longer about the Michelin star. It was about the journey that had brought them here and the future they were building. One day, Marcus received an invitation to an exclusive culinary event in Paris, where the world's top chefs would gather to showcase their talents. It was a prestigious opportunity, one that could cement his status as a global culinary force. But as Marcus read the invitation, he hesitated. The idea of leaving Sublime, even for a few days, felt wrong. This restaurant was his life's work, and he wasn't ready to step away from it, not even for a moment. That evening, he talked it over with Sophie. "It's a huge opportunity," she said, "but it's also okay if you don't want to go. You've spent so long building this place. Maybe now's the time to focus on enjoying it." Marcus smiled. "You're right. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." One night, a few months after receiving the Michelin star, Marcus stood at the edge of the kitchen, watching the dining room. The guests were laughing, smiling, savoring every bite. The energy in the room was electric, but it wasn't just because of the star. It was because Sublime had become something greater than any award or accolade. It was a place where people came to experience something real, something unforgettable. Sophie came up beside him, her apron dusted with flour. "It's a good night," she said, her voice light with satisfaction. Marcus nodded. "It is. We've got something special here, Sophie." She smiled. "We always did." As the night wore on, and the last of the guests left, Marcus felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The Michelin star had been a dream, but it wasn't the end. It was just one part of the journey. What mattered more was the restaurant, the team, and the love of the craft that had brought them all together. And in that moment, standing in the quiet of the kitchen with the faint hum of the city outside, Marcus knew that whatever came next, they were ready. Sublime was more than just a restaurant. It was home. The horizon beyond. Months after Sublime earned its Michelin star, the restaurant had settled into a new kind of rhythm. The intense pressure that followed the announcement had evolved into a quiet hum of daily excellence. Marcus, Sophie, and the team had learned how to live with the weight of their success. It no longer threatened to consume them, but instead propelled them forward with purpose. Yet even as they found their stride, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the next chapter of his culinary journey was beginning to take shape, just beyond his reach. He had achieved the dream of so many chefs, but Marcus had always been driven by more than accolades. It was about discovery, of flavors, of techniques, of himself as an artist. And as satisfied as he was with what they had built at Sublime, he could feel a restlessness growing inside him. The horizon was calling. One evening after service, Marcus sat at his usual spot in the kitchen, sipping a glass of red wine. The team had already left, and the quiet of the empty restaurant felt like a contrast to the energy that had filled the room just hours before. Sophie joined him, leaning against the counter, her own glass in hand. "You've been quiet lately," she said, her voice filled with curiosity. Marcus nodded, swirling the wine in his glass. "I've been thinking about what comes next." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Next? Marcus, we've been open less than 2 years, and we already have a Michelin star. What's left?" He smiled, appreciating her candor. "There's always more, Sophie. The star was just one goal. There are still things I want to explore, ideas I haven't had the time or space to try here." Her expression shifted, from playful curiosity to understanding. "You're thinking about another restaurant, aren't you?" Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe. I don't know yet. But I've been thinking about expanding, trying something different. I don't want to get complacent." Sophie took a long sip of her wine, watching him over the rim of the glass. "You're not someone who could ever be complacent, Marcus. But do you really want to leave Sublime behind so soon?" Marcus shook his head. "Not leave. I could never leave this place. But I've been thinking about a new concept, something that's been on my mind for a while." She set her glass down, intrigued. "Tell me." Over the next few weeks, Marcus shared his vision with Sophie, bouncing ideas off her as they navigated their usual routine at Sublime. He wanted to open a new kind of restaurant, one that would reflect a different side of his culinary identity. While Sublime was rooted in classical French cuisine with a Creole twist, his new concept would push even further into the fusion of tradition and innovation. He wanted to explore bold, unexpected pairings, blurring the lines between cuisines in ways that felt daring, almost rebellious. "I'm thinking about a tasting menu that's fluid," Marcus said one evening, his eyes alight with excitement. "Seasonal ingredients, of course, but no set courses. Everything would depend on what's available that day, that moment. Each dish would flow into the next, like a story told through flavors." Sophie nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. "It sounds incredible, but challenging. People are used to structure, especially at this level." "Exactly," Marcus replied. "I want to challenge that expectation. The dining experience should feel like an adventure, not just a sequence of dishes. And I want to bring in elements from places we've never even touched before. Asian influences, Middle Eastern spices, things people wouldn't expect from me." Sophie smiled. "Sounds like you're ready to push some boundaries." As Marcus began laying the groundwork for his new venture, he realized the scope of the challenge ahead. Opening a second restaurant while maintaining the excellence of Sublime was no small feat. But the more he thought about it, the more excited he became. He had spent years perfecting his craft, but this new project was an opportunity to reinvent himself once more. The search for a location took months. Marcus knew he couldn't simply replicate Sublime's atmosphere in another part of the city. This new restaurant needed to have its own identity, something that set it apart from the refined elegance of Sublime. He wanted it to be more raw, more vibrant, a space that invited spontaneity and experimentation. After visiting countless potential sites, he found it, a space in an up-and-coming part of the city, far from the high-end streets that Sublime called home. The building was an old industrial loft with exposed brick walls and massive windows that let in streams of natural light. It had an energy that felt alive, unfinished, like it was waiting to be transformed. As he stood in the empty space, Marcus could already see it in his mind. Open kitchen, communal tables, the smell of wood smoke and spices filling the air. It would be a place where diners could interact with the chefs, watch as their food was prepared in real time. The atmosphere would be more relaxed than Sublime, but the food would still be world-class, just different, riskier. The opening of the new restaurant, which Marcus named Ember, was met with immense anticipation. Word had spread that Marcus Hayes, the Michelin-starred chef of Sublime, was unveiling a bold new concept, and foodies from all over were eager to see what he had in store. On the opening night, Marcus stood in the kitchen, looking out at the dining room. It was a completely different vibe from Sublime. Louder, more dynamic, with a palpable excitement in the air. The kitchen was open, the flames from the wood-fired oven dancing in the background. His team was ready, a mix of veterans from Sublime and new faces eager to prove themselves. The menu was as unconventional as he had envisioned. There were no printed courses, no traditional starters or mains. Instead, dishes came out as they were ready, small plates bursting with flavor, each one telling a part of the culinary narrative Marcus had created. Scallops with miso butter and pickled radish, lamb belly with za'atar and charred eggplant, mango sorbet with chili lime salt and black sesame. Each bite was an experience, a journey into the unexpected. As the night progressed, Marcus felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, but it was different this time. Ember wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about pushing his own boundaries, about creating something that defied convention. The diners loved it, their reactions raw and unfiltered, as they laughed and marveled at each new dish. Sophie had been right. This was what he needed, not to leave Sublime behind, but to explore the horizon beyond it. As the weeks turned into months, Ember flourished. It quickly became the city's most talked-about dining destination, drawing in not just food critics but artists, musicians, and creative minds from all walks of life. Marcus thrived in the chaos and creativity of it all, bouncing between the kitchens of Sublime and Ember, each restaurant representing a different facet of his culinary soul. One afternoon, Marcus stood in the kitchen at Ember, watching the flames flicker in the oven. Sophie appeared at his side, her eyes bright with pride. "You did it," she said simply. He smiled. "We did it." Together, they had built something extraordinary. Two restaurants that were reflections of the same passion but expressed in completely different ways. And for Marcus, the horizon was still stretching out before him, endless and full of possibilities.